here, Mrs. Carney and MR, whoever that is, but welcome. And yeah, handing over to Lorna Hughes, who is Senior Lecturer at Canterbury Christ Church University and has really kindly agreed to do this talk for us this week, which happens to be Neurodiversity Celebration Week, which is a nice synergy because you have a special educational needs and inclusion specialism. Is that right, Lorna?
Yeah, that's right.
And yeah, we're going to be talking to us today about identification and supporting those with dyslexia in the classroom. Just as a reminder, Lorna, we are all secondary schools within our partnership. So, but obviously I know students arrive at secondary school without that having been identified. So I know this will be really helpful. So thank you for being here, and I will hand over.
Fabulous. Well, I'm going to share my PowerPoint, so I hope that that works and is visible to you.
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, so thank you all for joining me. Really appreciate you coming along after a busy day at school. Just to explain a tiny bit about my background information, as Sarah explained, I currently work at Canterbury Christ Church University and I lecture on the postgraduate certificate in dyslexia, actually. So those people that want to specialise in teaching and assessing children that might have dyslexia, which I was teaching today, actually, and also the National Award for SEN Coordination, so the qualification that SENCOs have to do as part of their practice, as well as other various teaching programmes. Before working at Canterbury Christ Church, so I started here about 7 years ago. Before that, I was in school as a secondary school teacher and also as a SENCO. So that's kind of a little bit of background information as to where I'm positioned and coming from with regard to the session and my background. And the focus for today's session, because obviously within an hour there's not always a great deal of time to cover very much. So what I've tried to do is I've focused it around identification for children with so how we look at identifying those challenges that children might be experiencing, but also with literacy, but also thinking about some of the strategies and how we might approach it in the classroom. So I've targeted and focused that around secondary, particularly, knowing your context that Sarah shared with me.
Lorna, can I just interrupt 1 second? I should have asked you before. Is it okay if, as we're going along, people have questions, they interrupt you? Or would you rather they put them in a chat?
Absolutely. Feel free to use the raise hand if you've got any questions as we go through the session. And I have also built opportunities in to discuss and share. So hopefully as well you'll be happy to participate because I think it also helps to, because of secondary and the nature of it and the so many different subjects in which we teach, it can also be helpful to kind of consider about how you apply certain strategies in your particular context, your subject that you teach. So there'll be opportunities as well for us to share and look at that. If you also, I just wanted to share my contact details. So if you do have questions after the session, so if there's anything that you don't think of in the session but you want to come back to me, do feel free to contact me via email. So I've put that on the screen for you, but Sarah's got my contact details as well. So I'd be happy to come back to you if you've got any further questions after the session. So first of all, I did want to start with an activity, and the activity is for you to use Menti to vote on something. So thinking about when we typically might be identifying dyslexia, what I wanted you to think about, and thinking across the age ranges. So would you typically see it identified when children are in primary school, secondary, across different phases? Where would you expect that to be identified based on your understanding so far, of teaching children that might have additional literacy needs? So we'll have a look at the results. If you haven't used Menti before, it's really easy. You can just do it on your phone if you've got a smartphone, or on your laptop. You just go to www.menti.com and then you just enter the code. It'll ask you for a code, and then you have different options to vote on. And what I'll do is also share the response as they come in. So I'll just see if I can open that now and check whether you can see it. So are you able to see it, or are you still seeing my PowerPoint? I just want to check whether it does share it on the screen. Okay, Sarah, are you still with us? I'm not sure if it.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I'm just trying to get into it myself. So yeah.
No problem. I just wondered, can you still see the PowerPoint, or are you able to see the Mentimeter?
No, I'm seeing the PowerPoint my end.
Okay, that's fine. I'll just open it on a separate screen. So I'll just give you a minute or two to see if you can respond, and then I'll open that up so that we can have a look at that. Okay, so I'm just going to refresh it and we'll see if there's any responses. Okay, so we've got one response saying typically it will be identified more commonly in secondary school. And just give it a minute or two if anyone else is voting. So you've got the options of where you might see dyslexia has been identified: primary, secondary school, further or higher education, or all phases of education. Okay. If there's any issues with accessing it, please do let me know. I can see we've got 5 people, so I'll just give it a minute or two to see if anyone else is able to vote. And it's just thinking about why we might consider this, because dyslexia is something which is persistent, ongoing, something that children don't grow out of. If they're identified and diagnosed as having dyslexia, that will be something that is persistent and they will find challenges as ongoing. So it's interesting to think about when it is identified, because in some cases it is identified at a later stage when you might have expected it to have been identified earlier. I know certainly as a secondary school teacher, sometimes we'd have children that would join us at secondary and we'd be quite shocked and think, oh, they've come and joined us from primary and they have these challenges. Why weren't they picked up in primary school? And that's something that we will sort of look at as part of the session. Right, I can't see any more voting. So what I'm going to do is, for the moment, I'm going to leave that and come back to it shortly. So I'll come back to that and just return to the PowerPoint. So if you bear with me, I'll just put the PowerPoint up again. And what we'll do is just look at why that happens, why that tends to happen. So I asked you to sort of vote on that, and we will have a quick look at it towards the end of the session. But the reason I was asking you to vote on it is that actually sometimes children are really good at putting in place, and young learners are putting in place different strategies so that things aren't necessarily always identified at an early stage. So, you know, where someone has dyslexia, they might have different ways in which they've worked out ways to mask it. It's not always necessarily as visible, and also it depends on the context in which that person is placed. So if somebody is in a context whereby they are able to use those strategies and they're effective and they're working and it masks the challenges that they have, they may not be identified. And then what happens is, obviously, as they move into different situations, different contexts and different demands that might be placed on them, it can then affect what happens with regards as to how they can engage with those literacy tasks. So we typically find that happens at different stages of their education. So a child might go all the way through primary and secondary, and then they're identified with dyslexia in further or higher education, because the having to work more independently, or the challenges of the work, places them in a context where the strategies that they've relied on in the past don't necessarily work. When I was in secondary school as a Senko, we had a young man who suddenly, when he was starting on his GCSE work, started to present with lots of challenges which we hadn't realised previously. And then when we did an assessment with him and looked at his literacy levels, he was actually doing a lot of sight reading and managing to get through by sight reading words rather than actually having the phonic knowledge to break down words. So where he was presented with more complex vocabulary, he was really not able to engage in that. So it was just to kind of get you thinking about it, because sometimes we'd expect children to be identified at an early age, because, as we said, dyslexia is persistent and ongoing across the lifespan, but that sometimes doesn't happen due to the context in which they're in, and whether there's strategies that they're using and support in their class that they then maybe move to a different class, and that's not the case and not in place. So I also wanted to share with you definition of dyslexia. So you may have come across this already and be familiar with the Rose report as well. But typically when we diagnose, we have to use a definition, which is one of them being the Rose definition. And you can see here that it outlines the different areas that we actually assess and look for in order to make that diagnostic decision. So difficulty primarily that affects the skills involved with accurate, fluent word reading and spelling. So those are the areas that we might see certainly in class as well. But also underpinning that, there's aspects of their cognitive profile that could be impacted upon as well. And one of those is phonological awareness. So phonological meaning their acquisition of sounds and being able to use sounds and process sounds as part of their language development, underpinning obviously those literacy aspects. Verbal memory, so being able to recall and use working memory around verbal information. And verbal processing speed. So that's why oftentimes we'll have extra time put into place for learners with dyslexia. It's not necessarily to check their work or to check their spellings. The extra time can oftentimes be related to the speed at which they're working, and sometimes they may need extra time in lesson to be able to produce the work of that quality of another child, and we'll look at why that is in just one second, why they might need additional time. Dyslexia often occurs across the intellectual abilities, so you could have children that are higher ability or children at low ability that could be diagnosed with dyslexia, so it's across the different abilities, and there's no clear cut-off point. It's like a continuum, so you can have somebody that's affected less and somebody that has more severe dyslexia as well. It's often co-occurring difficulties, so things like motor coordination and language aspects as well might co-occur with dyslexia. And it's also important for us to recognise that we don't diagnose dyslexia unless we can be assured that the children have had good quality education and opportunities to develop their literacy skills. That's a real challenge at the moment with the pandemic, because obviously we've got a lot of children that have missed big chunks of education, especially younger ones. So it's something that we need to be sensitive to. So I just wanted to share this with you. And this is a text that was created by Britain, and I want you to see if you're able to read this text. And this is why I was sort of explaining or mentioned about additional time, because the effort in which somebody is putting into reading can be quite a challenge if they have literacy difficulties. So I wanted you to just have a look at the text there and just see if there's any of the words that you can read. So I don't know if anyone wants to, in the chat, just type in any of the words that you're able to decipher, or if anyone wants to unmute themselves and share any of the words. Okay, I've got recreate. Okay, yep, well done for spotting that. Reading. I will give you the translation, so I give you a chance to have a look at it and see if there was anything. Typography, well done, yep. Okay, I'm going to add the definition into the chat so that in a moment, so that you can, yep, the word never as well been mentioned. This was actually created by somebody called Britain. I've put the link in the PowerPoint, and obviously I'll share the PowerPoint afterwards, to give you the sense of what it might be like if you have dyslexia, the slowing down of the reading, the process, the additional time that it takes to engage with something and process that information, it replicates it. So the text was designed to replicate that. And I think it's good for us to kind of go back to that and think about that, because it can be so much more effortful for somebody that has dyslexia to engage in some of those activities that we might have in the class, which are much more literacy focused. And so sometimes mixing things up and having different activities so that it's not too heavily led in that way can be really helpful. And also looking at ways in which we can identify when we do start to see those challenges, because as I said, really it can occur at any time during the learner's experience. They may not be identified earlier on because they might have been able to mask it or find strategies so that they've not been identified at an earlier stage. And the context in which they're working might have meant that it's not been evident. What I wanted to do was give you a tool, because as well, knowing being a teacher before, it's good to have resources and tools that you can actually practically use. And this is a screener. And again, I'll pass the information on to Sarah so that you have it if you want to use this in class. But it does go through some of the background types of things for a secondary school student that you might look for as traits and indicators as to have they got challenges with literacy specifically. So you can see some of them on the screen there, like word finding, etc. But persistent difficulties with spelling, poor structure and organisation of work, low self-esteem, those types of things. It's like a yes/no tick box. So it can be helpful to kind of think about what aspects to look for in secondary. And it might also, that kind of maybe corresponds a little bit with what we've talked about with regards to identification of learners at an older age. But what I want you to try and think about is, what are the potential issues of screening tools, though? If we're using something like this, like a checkbox, what might be a challenge around using that, or what might be a benefit? So again, I don't know whether you are able to add to the chat, whether you want to add a comment, or if anyone wants to unmute themselves to comment on this. So it can be helpful to understand some of the things to look for, but I don't know if anyone can think about what some of the challenges might be in using these types of checklists that are available. Okay, can't see that anyone's added anything in the chat, and I can't see any hands raised at present. I think everyone's probably having quite a long day, maybe not so willing to contribute now towards the end of the day. Something to obviously think about is it's a snapshot. So if you were just using this on one occasion to look at one child as a snapshot in a class, it's probably, there's a danger, of course, because you can then start to pick out aspects that maybe are not evident across a period of time. So I think always with things like checklists, it's about being sensitive to, it's one form of looking at aspects that you'd need to kind of correspond with other evidence. So thinking about their books, what they're producing in class, and if you're their teacher, you will have a good understanding of them as well over time, hopefully, and how they're engaging. So it's better to kind of use these alongside other forms of evidence as well, just so that you've got that fuller picture, rather than just seeing it as a. And also, sometimes when I look at this with some of the students that come onto the postgraduate certificate, they say to me, well, how many yeses and then it's dyslexia? And again, it's not really that. It's not that we look that every single thing is ticked off, because obviously every individual is going to be different. And then you might kind of fall into some areas and not into others. And so it's just important to kind of recognise that they are indicators and screeners, rather than, an actual definite, oh, this child, really has we certainly wouldn't use it as part of a diagnosis anyway or anything like that. So it's just being careful not to use them in a way that's not going to be helpful. It can help if we can start to look at areas of strength and areas of development moving forward. So I just wanted to share that, but I'll send that through with the reference for it to Sarah anyway, so that if you haven't seen it before, it might be helpful to think about some of the children in your class if you did have concerns. And what I wanted to do, because I knew we were limited for time, is to look at a focus really for some of the strategies that we might use in the classroom. And in doing that, I've looked at some of the research around developing literacy in secondary schools and how we can improve and support children with that aspect. So things that we could potentially use in the classroom. This comes from the Education Endowment Foundation piece of research they did in 2018, and you can see there's quite a lot of strands of literacy development that they've included here. The first one being sort of whole school literacy development. The second one we're going to look at in a bit more detail, and that's going to be the one that we look at now, which is targeting vocabulary. And there are a range of different strategies under that strand that could be used in the class, and also things that we can do that could feed in, I think, with lessons more easily. So things that we can be sensitive to or be thinking about as we're planning lessons. So that's why I've sort of selected this strand for us to look at in a bit more detail. So there's 4 different areas that we're going to look at. The first one you can see is providing explicit vocabulary instruction to help students understand academic language. The second one is including effective approaches, including those related to etymology and morphology, to help students to remember new words and make connections between words. And please don't worry about if you've not come across the terms before or you're uncertain about them, because I'm going to go through that in a second. Teachers should prioritise Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary, which students are unlikely to encounter in everyday speech. And teachers and subject leaders should consider which words and phrases to teach as part of curriculum planning. So I'm just going to literally take one by one from that, how we teach targeted vocabulary, to share with you the strategy and then get you to reflect on how it could work in your discipline, how you might take that forward in your class. So the first one is about providing explicit vocabulary instruction. And actually, I think sometimes this in secondary school, because we don't teach reading, you know, we by the time children join us in secondary, we anticipate that they've got the reading skills, we anticipate that they're comfortable with the vocabulary that we're using and those types of assumptions, which of course we know is not always the case for some of those learners, but it's not something that we've been explicitly taught as part of our training. I was an English teacher, and certainly I wasn't taught phonics or anything like that. That's something that I've then learned and taken on board as part of my professional development at a later date. So vocabulary instruction is not always something that we would necessarily think about, I think, in part of what we're teaching. And what I wanted to do is to share with you a model. There's a 6-step process for teaching vocabulary. This comes from Marzano, and again, I can share a sort of 2-page sheet which kind of goes into much more depth about the 6-stage process. But this might be something that you know, you might want to adopt or think about as part of your teaching within your subject area. When I was in practice myself in a secondary school, I found that modern foreign language teachers were brilliant at this aspect, the way in which they introduced vocabulary and the way in which they got children to engage with vocabulary in order to develop those literacy skills. So I think, you know, they're really good colleagues to work with as well if you wanted to develop ideas around how to support vocabulary instruction. But the rationale behind this is that actually if you're introducing something, so for example in science, if you're introducing new terms like photosynthesis or something like that, or in English onomatopoeia and those new kind of terms, subject specific terms, it could be a good strategy to include this as part of that introduction of the new vocabulary. So the first step is just providing a really clear description or explanation of that term. And you could do it in different ways. It could be through a story, through video, through thinking about mental pictures of the term, or those types of aspects, visuals, that could support that opportunity to explain what the term is. And then the second step is restate, and that's where you get the students then to tell you what the term means to them. So get them to restate the meaning of that term to you, so that they are taking ownership for it and they're thinking about it themselves based on their understanding. Show is when you ask students maybe to create a picture or a graphic or a symbol that they could then relate to that term. So it's obviously more difficult if it's abstract words or that you're trying to take forward, and it's going to be easier for words where there's something more concrete that they could draw. So photosynthesis, they might draw a leaf and draw the sun, but how do you draw onomatopoeia? But the principle, the idea behind it is that they engage with that word in a non-linguistic way. So they're making their own connections and able to kind of represent that visually themselves to help really understand the word and make. Oftentimes when we're teaching children with dyslexia, it's really looking at multisensory ways for them to engage with literacy so that they can draw on visuals and things like that, which might be a strength to help them to understand those linguistic terms. Step 4 would be discuss, and that's the opportunity then to put that word into context. So getting the children to discuss or think about that term would help them to maybe compare or contrast it with other words, or so how does that relate to other words on the subject that we've looked at already in class, and asking them to even think about, opposite words or similar words and those types of activity. Step 5 is when you refine and reflect. So ask them to kind of go back, maybe explain to each other what they think, and you can kind of then pick out if there's misconceptions, or they can seek clarification in that opportunity as they engage with the particular words. And then the final step is like apply in learning, and that can be done through a game. It could be something as they exit the room, there could be a comment or something around whatever the word was or the focus of that word. So alongside the lesson that you're teaching, this 6-step process could be something that's integrated. So obviously you wouldn't be explicitly just teaching that aspect at the start of the lesson. You might explain the term as we would anyway as part of the focus and the lesson objective that we're taking forward, but then as you go through the lesson you then restate it. Okay, so tell me, what does that mean to you? So you just kind of integrate it and use those processes to ensure that the vocabulary is being taught explicitly for those children that might need that overlearning and that opportunity to engage with the vocabulary more than once. I wanted you to think about how it relates to your subject area, whether that could work for you, whether that's something you think might work in your, or if there's any questions about that before we move on to the next approach and consider that. I don't know if anyone wants to type anything or if anyone has any questions at all before we move on. Okay, please do feel free to interrupt me at any point if there is anything that you want to raise or ask. Or so etymology and morphology, the second strand also included the recommendation that we have effective approaches, including those related to etymology and morphology, that will help students remember those new words and make the connections between words. So obviously we've got these different types of strands here that are being suggested. So phonics knowledge is that idea of the letter and sound correspondence and relates to sound. And, we have a structured synthetic phonics approach in schools, in primary schools, where they're being taught that before they join us in secondary school. And of course, some of the children in secondary school will have intervention and support around that phonics as well as they progress in through secondary school. But there are also other ways in which to support spelling. And one of them is looking at the relationships in patterns. So the idea of, etymology is actually essentially looking at words and where they've come from. So when you're looking at spelling patterns and where they've come from, that can be quite helpful to children to see the similarities and differences, or if there are patterns and regularities that they can be aware of. So one of them is the shun sound. So I've given you there apprehension, depression, expectation, determination, mathematician, and electrician, with 3 different ways of spelling the shun sound. And, you know, to somebody without being explicitly taught or thinking about it, may struggle and find it difficult to decide which representation they would take forward for that sound, whether it's S-I-O-N, T-I-O-N or C-I-A-N. And understanding that the word apprehend ends in a D, depress ends in a S, and when it's a D and an S sound, it would change to S-I-O-N, could help some children to make those decisions around which spelling pattern they're using and why. So opportunities, I guess, when that vocabulary occurs in your subject, to be explicit and underline and look at that pattern. Where else did we see that? Why is it similar? Why is it different? So that's the idea behind teaching with that approach. And then morphology, looking at the principle of root words and similarities in root words. So you can see the example there. You've got medical, medicine, medic, and looking at when that occurs, when you have that root word to help you with spelling then other similar words. Sometimes it can be really helpful as well to create like a word web. So you'd have the root word in the middle, and then actually how many words can you think about that come from that as well, or that are similarly spelled, and almost have like a word web to represent that, and can be something that's more visual as well for children. So again, I'm just going to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions, or if anyone wants to share or think about how that might work in your subject area, or if it'd be more challenging in your subject area. I think the less discussion that we have, it might go quite quickly, the session. I was planning, if we had 20 participants, that there might be some comments in the chat and some discussion around each of the areas and how they might work in your setting. I can't see as yet any comments.
Yeah, sorry, Lorna, there's
no problem.
as many attending tonight as I hope, but
not a problem. I mean, as well, I do appreciate it's a long old day, and we've got, it's quite a challenge as well. I think, I appreciate those that have come along to the session this evening as well. And obviously I don't want people to feel on the spot, so it's no problem if you're happy just to listen in and think about it and have some reflections, that's fine too. But do feel free to interrupt me if there is anything that you want to raise. The idea between tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary, if you haven't come across that before, you may well have come across it, but it's the idea that in tier 1, it's type of language that we encounter and engage with daily, and it's high frequency kind of words that would occur in speech and in our context in which we're in. So you've got a few examples there on the triangle, like table, slowly, write, and obviously that's the largest part of the triangle because that's the bulk of the language that we're encountering, so the language that children might be more familiar with, more comfortable with. Tier 2 is more high frequency words that are less common in speech and might occur more so in written form. So you've got words there as examples like beneficial, required, maintain, and being able to of include those words more explicitly, and the teaching of those types of words as well could be quite valuable for children so that it's not so unfamiliar. And I think also sometimes unpicking it. So I've certainly worked with learners where I have this assumption that they know a word and that they're unfamiliar with the context, and then actually when we unpick it, they've not come across it before. I was looking at a teaching video for one of the children because I have to assess the teaching that's happening for dyslexia. And one of the terms that they were talking about in their session was malicious. And he was trying to define what malicious was. He was kind of half there. And then he said about the film, oh, I think it's Maleficent, or I can't remember now what the term actually is, but it's the Disney film, and she's the evil villain, and he kind of made that connection with her name and the word malicious, and kind of said, oh yeah, that's, you know, he could understand it. So he made his connection to help him with that understanding of that word. And then obviously at tier 3, the smallest part of the triangle, because it's less common, would be that specialist subject language that you might have. So like we said earlier, like photosynthesis, trigonometry, you know, those specific terms that you're using as part of your academic language in your subject areas. And again, those that would need explicitly teaching because they're not going to be as familiar. They're not words that are as common and we engage with so frequently. And, you know, and repeating and then revisiting and going over that, or even having vocabulary books. The guidance that I'll send through to Sarah for you about the 6 stages actually talks about having a vocabulary book or having something in the back of your book which is focused more on vocabulary. Okay, so the other area that was, or the 4th sort of area that was outlined as part of the strand that we're looking at from the Education Endowment Foundation was about words and phrases as part of the curriculum. And the guidance is around teachers and subject leaders considering which words and phrases to teach as part of curriculum planning. And what I've highlighted here is some of the words that would go across different disciplines, different subjects in school, but they may also have slightly different meanings depending on which subject you're in. And also they have quite specific meanings in some cases on exam papers and that type of thing. So here we've got the terms analyse, explore, discuss, which you would see on an exam paper in different subjects. But actually, if it says analyse, what does that mean? What do we expect the children to do? And do we sometimes think that they understand those terms that are occurring on the paper and then what they have to then do as part of it? And the reason I'm highlighting this as well is when I was in practice and as a secondary school teacher, Senko, I worked with a speech and language therapist who actually came into the session to deliver some specific input, but we did it as a bit of a whole class starter activity. And we took each of these terms from the exam paper, and because we had children that would have challenges around understanding those specific terms, we put together visual mind maps showing what each term meant and adding images as well to kind of reinforce that in a visual way for those students. So every time we looked at an exam question, we also had that support material. So we did it as a bit of a starter activity with the children, but then we also had that as a reminder whenever we then looked at exam questions. So what did we mean when we were talking about discuss? What does that mean when you see it on the exam paper? And they had the visual prompt as well to go back and support them with it. And so I think sometimes, again, it's a bit of a challenge because we have these terms that we're probably more comfortable with as teachers, but explicitly supporting children to understand what they mean in the class, you know, can be beneficial in their engagement and how they then can more independently engage with their exam papers and things like that when they see those particular terms. So I'm just going to pause again to see if there's anything that anyone wants to share or any questions about the different things that I've shared on the screen. Okay. can't see that there's hands raised or anything, so I'll move on, because I wanted to also share some resources with you. So I thought it was helpful, hopefully, to look at or think about the strategies from the Education Endowment Foundation, because that was fairly recent research a couple of years ago, and also gives a focus for some of the things that we can do in class to support. It will support other children anyway, of course, in their understanding, but it would certainly support children that might have literacy challenges and difficulties, or if they have dyslexia, even if it's unidentified, having further support around vocabulary development, and that literacy element would really support them. But I just wanted to highlight with you these further resources. Some of them I'm sure you'll be aware of. So test resources, there's a huge amount on there in relation to supporting vocabulary development as well as phonics as well, which, as I say, is not something I think in secondary we're as used to, but even just let's sound that out, and writing it and sounding it out on the board when there is a query over spelling can be really helpful and supportive. And the IDP online, I don't know whether you've come across this before. It has to be opened in Internet Explorer. It doesn't work on Chrome for some reason. I think it's because it was created a number of years ago now. But they are actually training modules. So they're a whole kind of online resource module that you can work through. And they were created by the DFES at that time. And you have one that's focused around dyslexia. You have another one which is focused around autism. So they're actual kind of engaging materials. You do a baseline kind of knowledge audit of your own skills in relation to your understanding of that area. And then you work through the activities and then the resources that are available to you, and then reflect on how you've developed your understanding. So they're kind of online modules. The Inclusion Development Programme that was put together, I think probably 2009, 2010, so they're about 10 years old, but there are some really useful resources still in there to kind of engage with. Universally speaking can be helpful. So this is more around language development, which of course links very much with children that might have dyslexia. But the reason I'm sharing that with you is it actually outlines what children you would expect to see children that are typically developing their language skills, what you'd expect to see for an 11-year-old, what you'd expect to see for a 13-year-old, what you'd expect to see for a 15-year-old. So it actually tells you about where you would expect to see their language development, so that you can see if there's any areas that are challenging for that young person, and maybe that there needs to be further support around that. So similar to the screening checklist, that's something, and again we have to be careful because children of course all develop at different stages, and there's sometimes things that impact on their learning, so they might not follow that kind of, you know, continuous development. So it's looking at it with a judicious eye, but you know, sometimes it's helpful to just have those resources as well to think about where we'd expect children to be at particular ages. The literacy interventions on the link there by Brooks, they've gone through different kind of revisions. The most recent one's 2020, so 2 years ago, but it actually looks at specific interventions around literacy. So there are a range in there, and it refers you to the evidence base around it. So it talks about whether the evidence is robust. It also includes in there whether it's an intervention, whether it can be run in class. So is it a universal provision that you could put into place in class, or if it's something that's more specific to be run as an intervention, and explains about whether you need skills to do it or whether it can be run by a TA or by a teacher. So that was just to guide and provide you with some guidance around that. And then one that I'm going to show you from wider resource here is it's actually a research report about different interventions in relation to special educational needs, but there is an aspect in there that links in with literacy. So I'm just going to see if I can share that with you now. Just see if I can open that screen. Won't keep you a second. Oh, just seeing if I'm opening the correct one. Sorry, won't keep you a moment. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen here. I'm just going to go into the report and page 82, I think it is. It actually covers all areas, the 4 broad areas of need. So communication, interaction, cognition and learning, social, emotional, mental health. It covers each of the 4 broad areas of need, but then it specifically goes into more areas. So here you can see it's divided into literacy needs, writing needs, numeracy and thinking skills under cognition and learning. And actually, as you scroll down, you can see that there's evidence base in literacy approaches for Key Stage 1 and 2, but obviously you're Key Stage 3, 4 and post 16. So if you scroll down further, you can see that actually it's got a range of different activities and interventions and support, looking at different strategies, whether it's teaching system, whether it's something that you can put into place as an additional activity, or whether it's something in class, that strategy. So it tells you a little bit about what it is, and then it also shows you where you can find further details around it. And then the same again for writing approaches. You've got something here, and some of them are quite simple things that could be adopted or put into place. So self-regulated strategy development, so scaffolded instruction and planning, in composing and revising, and then you've got some resources around that as well to put it into place if you wanted to use it in class, using graphic organisers. Again, you've got some resources. I've used Inspiration, which is great if you haven't used it. It's a visual mind map on a computer, but then you can click a button and it translates that visual mind map into like an essay plan. So you can kind of visually plan an essay, but then by clicking the button to transfer it into written form, it just then transfers it into almost like an essay plan for you. So again, you know, could be something that children could engage with to help if they have challenges around literacy. So hopefully it's helpful to see some of the resources, and as I say, those ones are there really for you to just explore and see if they might be helpful to you to use in class. Or so I'm going to stop sharing that now and just go back to the PowerPoint, but I think really the end of the PowerPoint was just to ask if you have any questions at all. So I'm just going to quickly scroll down. So yeah, literally just to ask if you have any questions at all. I'd be happy to answer those. So I'll actually I'll send through the PowerPoint with the references and everything and the resources for you. But it's about coming up for 10:02. And yeah, I don't know if anyone has anything they want to ask or share just in the last few minets.
Well, thank you so much, Lorna. I'm going to stop the recording, and then if anyone's got any questions, they can ask them about their individual school.